Thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure actually to teach. I do like teaching at summer schools, even though I do have to say I prefer much more to do it face-to-face rather than online. But by now I've done so many of these online things that I'm almost getting used to it, but not quite. All right, so today what I'm going to talk to you about is this concept of resilience, and in particular I'm trying to frame it in the context of peripheral areas, which in Italy actually have been renamed inner areas. I'll tell you in a second why. Well, you must have heard the term resilience a zillion times by now, and because since the crisis of 2009, so the big recession, it became a very popular concept. And of course now the COVID-19 is helping this concept gaining even more popularity. So of course, urban and regional scientists, urban and regional economists are always very good to pick up on fashions. And so they highlighted immediately the importance of applying the concept of resilience to their field of study, so to urban and regional resilience. And in fact, in 2010 and then 2012 and then 2017, there were 3 special issues in regional science journal, which were completely devoted to this concept of regional resilience. So what it's really clear is that different regions have different levels of resilience as they have different potential for growth. But like all these fast-growing concepts, right? Hill and Atkins point out that when you have a concept that is so popular and is used so frequently in so many different fields, it is rarely well-defined. So let's start from the basic. I always like to look at some kind of dictionary. When I define a concept, I always go back to the initial meaning and then I see how it evolves. So it is actually a concept borrowed by physical sciences. And you know this stress ball that you actually squeeze and then they go back to their normal shape, of which I put an image there. That's exactly the concept of resilience and it was intended in these physical sciences. Because it's the ability or an entity, a system or whatever to recover from, to recover the form and the position that you had before in an elastic way. So you disturb the system, you squeeze the ball, but then the ball goes back to the original shape it had before. And this is the original traditional concept of resilience. Of course, for a region, this translates into the ability to recover from a negative external shock. Here I put a graph that comes from one of my papers. Actually, I borrowed it from the OECD as well, in which you can see the 2009 recession and how it perturbed all the different countries, and then eventually they went back to some kind of normal path. There are different ways that you can interpret what recover means. The initial first approach, which is also called the equilibrium approach, it refers to the ability of a system to bounce back. So you squeeze the ball like before, and then the ball goes back exactly to how it was before. This one implies basically that there is a pre-existing equilibrium state, a single equilibrium, to which the system tends to kind of, go back. The second approach is more adaptive, it's more evolutionary, so to speak. It's the one that Ron Martin and Peter Stanley talked a lot about. And this one, it's the ability not to bounce back, but to bounce forward. So you have a stress, a system gets disrupted. Instead of going back to what it was before the stress, you try to move forward. You try to take the opportunity to do things in the future better than you did before. Very important, this concept, for instance, for the reconstruction of the city where I'm in, which was struck by an earthquake in 2009. So mentioning the special issue that I mentioned before, and also Ron Martin and Peter Stanley, they did a lot of work on regional resilience. I like this paper of 2012 and then the co-author one with Stanley in 2013, in which basically they identify a series of steps that they all form the concept of resilience. The first step in this resilience idea, it's what's called resistance. Resistance. So when you perturb a system can go down very deeply, or it can kind of resist. It's the opposite of what some other authors call vulnerability. So the resistance is the -1 of vulnerability. And this is what you notice during the stress or a little bit after the stress. So the number of death during the COVID crisis, or how far the system will go down, it's the kind of resistance to a system. After this initial shock and this stress that the system has to endure, then there is the recovery process. So how far can we actually recover after the system has been perturbed? So it's the speed and degree of recovery. And then finally, there is another phase which is often overlooked, but it's very important. And it's that often the system, as I said before, does not go back to the original position, but actually changes while it recovers. And so the last phase, very important, but also very difficult to study, is the reorientation and renewal phase. So it's the ability of a region to adapt in response to a shock and go to a different growth path. So here is a question. Here you have 3 different growth paths. They are all disturbed by a kind of shock, in this case, the recessionary shock. And the question is, which one is the most resilient? Well, first of all, the first one, obviously, it's the one that goes down and never quite goes back up. So it's definitely the least resilient. But the other 2 are both resilient, but they are resilient according to two different notions. And I'm going to tell you in a second what I'm referring to. And by the way, this drop that you see, it's the vulnerability or the opposite of resistance, while the recovery period is this increase that takes you to whatever new growth path you are aiming at. As I was saying before, so the second graph in the slide before, it's what has been named in 1973 by Holling the engineering resilience. This idea of resilience implies that there is one long-term equilibrium and that eventually the system tends to gravitate around this equilibrium and goes back to the pre-shock growth path. So if you look at the pre-recessionary period and the post-recessionary period, post-recovery, you can see that the 2 lines here are actually parallel. There is a recovery period in which the growth occurs even faster than before, but then eventually there is this equilibrium and the rate of growth becomes the same as before the shock. But what is more interesting is this ecological kind of resilience, which implies the idea that there are multiple equilibria. So if the growth rate before the shock was 3%, it doesn't go back to be 3%, it could be 4, 5, 6, it could even change later on. And the shock, in this case, becomes an opportunity to do better than the past. And if anything, to grow faster than before. But you find all sorts of contribution on resilience, and it's very difficult, like with the COVID data a little bit, to do comparison between all these different studies, because very often they don't really clarify the scope of their study. As I said before, resilience has been criticized because, like most of these fast rising in popularity concept, has a certain degree of fuzziness around it, right? And moreover, even when you are clearly identifying what you mean by resilience, it's very difficult to measure it because it's really a challenge to find the data or to identify the proper dimension that you should use to measure it. So I think there are 3 fundamental questions that you have to clarify before actually you present some kind of empirical analysis on resilience. The first thing is resilience to what? Are you studying a natural disaster? Are you studying a recessionary shock? Are you studying a sanitary shock like the COVID is right now? Because this is important because it implies different notions and hypotheses on what then you are trying to go and study. The second is resilience of what? So are you looking at employment? Are you looking at innovation of an area? Are you looking at GDP? Are you looking at death of people? Whatever. What is the dimension you are looking at? And the second is, you're talking about resilience, but over what period? Because there could be a short-term resilience, a medium-term resilience, a long-term resilience, according to how long after the shock you're actually looking at the system. So as I said before, resilience to what? The first field in which the concept of resilience was applied was actually in the natural disaster literature. So here there are a few contributions on that, but it kind of makes sense, right? Because the natural disaster like an earthquake are kind of the shock, the most obvious shock you can think for a system. There's also physical destruction and whatever. You also have this opportunity to rebuild from scratch. So, you know, when you think of a shock, obviously some kind of natural disaster would be the first one that comes to mind. But as I said before, it really became very popular when we had the Great Recession in 2009. So the concept of resilience in this case was more economic, and it referred to economic downturns, a recessionary shock. But it has been applied to all sorts of different problems in economics as well, like for instance, the housing foreclosure of certain areas, or even in 2013, to the influx of immigrants. However, for some of these shocks, for instance, for the influx of immigrants, you need to clarify the threshold after which this becomes a shock. An influx of immigrants, if the immigrants are not that many, does not really qualify to be a shock to the system. They normally integrate, there is no issue. But when there was a refugee crisis in recent years, the number of immigrants was so high that it could have been interpreted as a shock to the system. So what is the minimum magnitude or the minimum duration that qualifies certain factors to be certain external factor to be a shock, and hence you can actually talk about resilience. That is very important as well. So here I put the example of immigrants. When does an influx of immigrants represent a shock to the system? Well, what is it, 5%, 2%, 3%, 10%? What it is that we believe to be big enough to represent a shock. And of course, here I always like to go on the web and find all these images. Ever since COVID-19 appeared, struck the system, you can find the combination of COVID-19 and the word resilience almost everywhere. Rural resilience action, time for solidarity and resilience, building resilient society. And then also I put actually the website of this European Commission publication, the ERSA Center, because I thought it was interesting. It's a set of researchers in Italy that actually did this time for transformative resilience, the COVID-19 emergency. And they use this concept of ecological resilience, adaptive ability, not just going back to the original position. And then you have the resilience of what? This is the most difficult part. So you identify the stressor that informs the scope of your analysis. But how do you measure the resilience of an economic system? And this is something, you know, I always care about talking because I am a regional economist. At what geographical scale? So the measurement. What most studies that deal with resilience in regional economics do is just identify some variables of interest. Sometimes there is also a lack of data at a finer geographical scale. And so the most common used ones are actually either employment data or income data. Some of them actually use the population size. But there have been other studies that looked at the drop in consumption or the increase in innovation or decrease in innovation. So the variable that you are using to identify what you mean by resilience is very important. And you can just use one, you can use a couple separately, and then compare the results that you have to show the robustness of your models. A lot of studies on what they call community resilience, which are a little bit more common maybe in sociology, but also in, say, environmental economics, at least in the US, that was the case. they don't like to use separate variables, and they prefer to build economic indicators. So they have some resilience indicators in which they combine all these different dimensions, not just economic, but also environmental, social, and so on. There are, of course, pros and cons in using economic indicators. One is obviously that you are looking at a more systemic concept of resilience. And in a sense, in this way, it's more complete. However, I'm always a little bit skeptical of economic indicators because they imply a certain level of subjectivity. First of all, which variable do you put inside an indicators? And then even more importantly, what way do you give to each variable to build the economic indicators? There are advanced ways of actually doing it, even using more objective ways like regressions, but you know, the weight that you give to the single variables to build an indicators, it's always a problem. And moreover, an economic indicators, it's hiding some information, right? Because you are combining things, so the effect, in a sense, cancel each other out. But it is commonly used also as a dependent variable. And then you have the problem of the geographical scale. This is common not just to the study of resilience, but to any kind of study that you are planning to do in the field of regional science. Because what makes sense? We've seen before data on countries, and then we had a discussion on the NARSC regions, because maybe in that context that was also important. You can use provinces, municipality, or you can use local labor systems. What's the difference between the first four geographical scales and the local labor systems? Well, basically the local labor system are functional areas, while the other ones are administrative boundaries. Data are normally more available at administrative boundaries, and that is why we do research on regions, NARSC if we want to do cross-country comparison, municipality, and so on. Local labor systems are built on this concept of commuting, so they're functional, they depend on the labor market. They are actually, in my opinion, better to study certain aspects, including, for instance, when you talk about resilience and employment, but the data are an issue because sometimes you do not have all the data that you would like to have to study the phenomenon. But I will get back to this in my example in a second. And then there is the time period, and this is crucial. Because in a sense, you want to say something about what is going to happen after a crisis as soon as possible, but at the same time, as soon as possible, it means you don't have the data to study the recovery of, from a shock. So there is a kind of short-term recovery versus the kind of more medium long-term effects of a shock. And for that, you have to wait until the data become available. So what's the appropriate temporal framework to assess the resilience of a region? I believe that as long as you are clear in what is your aim, so if you say, well, this is just an initial short-term assessment of the resilience of a region, it's okay, but you have to be clear on what is your scope and aim in whatever you write. There are also two corollaries to this, what is the appropriate temporal framework question, which is, are we sure that bouncing back faster is a sign of being more successful than in the long run? Or bouncing back faster, it means really that you are going back to whatever was there before, but you haven't really adapted, and so you didn't have this transformative resilience as the report of the JRC was saying before. And then, of course, even more interesting is to look at both. So if you can do a study in which you look at the short, medium, and long-term resilience, and then you can actually see this correlation between these two short and long-term dimensions is generally, at least in most of the regions, strong or not. But clearly, so this is very common in my talk. I always kind of ask questions and then I always answer with it depends, but it does depend. The answer to what is the right regional level, what is the right time period, strictly depends on the type of shock that you analyze and your research question and your aim. So as long as you are clear in what you do, you are fine, but you have to be clear on what is your scope. Right, okay, so before I actually go into the kind of more peripheral regions talk, I just wanted to show you this very quick example. This is a paper that was published in the Annals of Regional Science in 2017 with other 3 co-authors. And so the aim of our paper was to assess not so much the resilience, but the resistance and short-term recovery. So the first 2 phases that Ron Martin was talking about in Italian areas after the 2009 recession. So the to what question is the 2009 recession. The of what question, we were looking at the employment variable. These were the data that we had, and we were just looking at one specific variable, not an indicator. And the geographical scale was the local labor market system, because we were looking at employment, so we thought it made more sense, even theoretically. And then the time period, we were looking at resistance, so during the crisis, how far down this system went, and then the short-term recovery. So it was just 1.5 years after the recession, and we were just looking at how and if this area were growing. Just to give you an idea of what the local labor market system looked like in Italy, you know, we have 20 regions. You can see these are the darker borders. I don't know if you can see the gray ones are actually the local labor market system. So there are 686 of them, and they're functional areas. All the previous works, contribution that study resilience in Italy, all of them looked at the 20 regions, but the 20 regions are far too big. There is a lot of variability within each region. And in the paper, we discuss this a lot, and we are also looking at the between and within variance to make a point that we need to go to a final scale. So we went back to the paper by Martin, and we simply reproduced the indexes that he was proposing for resistance and recovery. So the resistance is a kind of location quotient of how far down the region went compared to the previous period, compared to the nation. So it's a kind of percentage change in the region divided by the percentage change in the nation. And so you read it the same way, right? Above 1, the region did better than the nation. Below 1, it did worse. We mapped it, and what we could notice was the usual north-south divide. So red is bad and blue is good. The usual kind of, you know, north-south divide, the south went down a lot more than the north, but also, and I don't know if you can see it, but if you look at the Apennines, basically, and the Alps, so the kind of areas that in Italy are called inner areas, and so they're more peripheral, we could also see a sort of urban-rural divide, although we didn't study it in this paper. Then we looked at the recovery. This is how far the employment grew after the crisis. But what we did, which is what I wanted to show you, is actually then we created 4 categories of local labor markets, combining these 2 dimensions, resistance and recovery. So in quadrant 1, you have the best, the one that were high resistance and fast recovery. In quadrant 3, you have the worst, low resistance, low recovery. And then in the other 2 quadrants, you have a combination of the 2. So some places that had a high resistance but slow recovery, and some other that actually had a low resistance, so they went down quite a bit, but then they had the ability to recover quicker. We did a multinomial logit using these 4 categories as dependent variable. And here is something interesting, because we talked about tourism. So what came out very clearly is that, see, this quadrant 1, the high resistance, fast recovery, local labor markets with a tourist vocation were almost 4 times more likely to be in that quadrant than in the other. So there was a cluster of tourist locations in this, say, best quadrant. Also, the areas that did the best were not the very small ones, the rural, were not the large cities, but they were the one of intermediate size. This is actually not something unusual. When we saw these results, we thought, oh my goodness, but this debate on the intermediate size cities and the potential that they have, actually, it's common now. A lot of people are saying it. Also, talking about the industrial district. So industrial districts are a strength of the Italian economy. So they resisted a little bit the crisis, probably because, you know, they had some kind of accumulated resources from before. But once they went down, it was more difficult for them to recover. You must have heard this process of lock-in. So you lock in into certain abilities, let's say, and then it's more difficult for you to adapt. So they were not very good in this adaptive resilience idea. But we did not look specifically, as I said, at peripheral areas in this paper, although the population size was in the model, and that is a proxy for areas that are a little bit more peripheral. So now the problem is, why did we start looking at peripheral areas? In 2007 was the year that urban population surpassed the rural population. In 2014, 54% of the world population was urban. By 2015, 7 out of 10 people will live in urban areas. So if you talk to a straight urban economist, they pretty much tell you, we don't care about peripheral areas. Why should we study peripheral areas? Everybody should go to the city. There is an agglomeration economy, so let's progress with that. Yes, that would have been okay, but the peripheral areas made their voice heard very strongly in recent elections. Of course, going from the presidential election in 2016, where Donald Trump won in rural areas, while Hillary Clinton was actually winning in cities. Here are 2 states. I used to live in Columbus, Ohio. See, Columbus, Ohio, the city, or Cleveland or Cincinnati, which are the largest cities in Ohio, were all blue. But all the rest, which is pretty rural, it was all Republican. Same in other countries. If you look at Pennsylvania or whatever, you can see sorry, this is New York State. You can see that it's the same thing. New Albany, Syracuse, New York City, Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, the cities were blue, but all the rest was red. And here it gives you a better idea. So this is a map in which we scale the size, well, they scale the size of the counties to be proportional to the population. So it doesn't quite look anymore like this, right? There is a lot more blue, because what happened was that the largest countries voted for Hillary Clinton, while the red one for Trump. And the same on this one on the left. The size of the square tells you the size of the counties that voted for them. As you can see, the squares that are blue are a lot larger than the ones that are red, which are really tiny. So that is an urban rural. Same for the UK, Brexit, but I'm not gonna, you know the story, you've heard it probably a zillion times, including from probably Andres and Phil, Andres Rodriguez-Pos and Phil McCann. These are other examples in Europe. There has been a sort of wave of discontent that was very clear in rural areas compared to the peripheries. The rural-urban divide is not, of course, new, but many commentators have pointed out that the polarization have actually grown. I'll give you the slides. You can have all the literature in the future because it's all in there. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. This is another interesting article in 2008, actually, well before the Trump election, that was showing how the urban-rural divide in the US became even stronger than the North-South divide. In the US, as in the UK, as in Italy, there is a strong North-South divide, but the urban-rural in the US is now overwhelmingly more important than the North-South. Again, a growing sense of alienation of these places. They believe that their fate was not connected to the central places anymore, and the Great Recession and globalization, if anything, exacerbated this pattern that was already present. This is a very interesting special issue of The Economist dedicated to these left behind places. Andres Rodriguez-Pos always talk about that. And then there are a lot of contribution. Capello et al. In 2015 talked about the high degree of spatial heterogeneity when you looked at the effect of the crisis. So territorial uneven impact and so on. And I'm wondering now, how is COVID going to play on this? Globalization definitely went one direction. COVID, I believe, could go in the same direction, in the sense that although the rural areas were hit less than the cities, the recessionary crisis that will follow might probably again widen the gap between the urban and rural regions. So we do have to pay attention and learn some lessons from the 2009 recession. Not only, though, we are looking at peripheral areas because they are discontent, we are also looking at peripheral areas because these areas face two types of challenges. There is this article by Pendle in 2010 in which basically he divides external disturbances into two categories. There are acute shocks, and these are the ones we have been talking about, the Great Recession, COVID, and so on. But there are also these slow burns processes that have been there for decades, right? That they have mined the systems, and that, you know, these systems are long out of equilibrium. This is a very nice article if you manage to actually have a look at it. And so that's very important. And because we recognize that these slow burn processes have been going on for forever, basically in Italy, in 2012-13, the government started this project on inner areas. As I said, we call them inner areas, these peripheral areas, because they are inside Italy. They are along the Apennines and inside some areas of the plain in the north, and then in the across the border in the north. And so they are far, these centers are far from essential services, so they lack proper schools, hospital, trains. You have to travel quite a bit to go to these places, and they suffer the slow burn on top of being also more likely to have acute shock such as earthquakes, especially in the center of Italy. This is quite common. They have been defined actually exactly using the travel time to these central places that offer essential services such as school, hospital, and trains. So there are 6 degrees of peripherality. Of course, the urban pole are the center. Then you have the kind of the places surrounding these urban poles. Then you have like the outlying areas, which are areas that can reach the center in less than 20 minutes drive. And then you go down 20 to 40 minutes, you have these intermediate areas, peripheral areas, you have to drive between 40 to 75 minutes. If you have to drive longer than 75 minutes to go to hospital or to go to school or to get a decent train station, then you are considered ultra peripheral. And as I said, this is the population change from 1971 to 2011. I always put green something that is positive, so the population increase, and red is actually population decrease. Aside from this north-south divide, you can see that if we restrict to inner areas in the second map, these are the areas with the highest depopulation. So this is slow burn in the last 50 years. Again, so this is a second example that I'm gonna introduce to you with the idea of stimulating or showing you how, you know, I've done research on this topic. This is a more recent article published this year in the journal Sustainability, which is more on geographical side. Again, the difference between this paper and the paper before is that here the focus was to look at different levels of resilience along the urban hierarchy. So we used these 6 categories to see whether there were differences. And instead of focusing on resistance and recovery, we wanted to go a little bit further and look at the reorientation of the industries in these 6 different levels of urban hierarchy. I'll go a bit quick because I'm already on 33 minutes. Again, to what? We are still looking at the recessionary shock. Of what? We are still focusing on employment, no complex index. However, we did change the level of analysis to the municipal level. So we have 8,000 municipalities in Italy, so it's much smaller. We had to go, so the level is very fine, but we couldn't use the local labor market systems because you can't just simply put municipalities together and get local labor market system. They're not overlapping. And we didn't have the data to actually do the analysis at local labor market system. So we went even further down, let's say. We use 82-digit sectors, so different industries, and the time period is slightly longer because we don't stop at 2011, but we're actually looking at the period 10-year period from 2004 to 2014, so we have a little bit longer after the crisis. Some descriptives. So we start with, some descriptive to have an idea of how the trend, the growth was going over time. This is the growth rate of employment. And you can see Italy, it's the blue line. And then you have the peripheral areas are the green one and the centers are the red one. You can see how the trends were very different. And in fact, peripheral areas had some kind of a 2-year delay and a deeper recession. We also had a double dip afterwards and whatever, but the fact that there was a 2-year delay was actually due to this idea that we didn't have only the financial crisis of 2009. The financial crisis obviously happened more in the central locations like Milan, where there was the stock market and so on. But then this financial crisis became an economic crisis. The effect spread, and this spread occurred especially in the more peripheral areas. So a delay, but then when they went down very badly. Here we actually subdivided not just periphery and center, but all the 6 levels that I told you before. Sorry for the Italian, but and what we found out is that among the most central areas, it is actually the areas surrounding the big cities that perform the best. This kind of idea of this intermediate ground between the center and the periphery that did well, according to my previous paper, the one I showed you before, but also Lewis Dijkstra, together with co-authors, showed the same, that in the whole of Europe, the regions that responded the best on average to the crisis were actually the intermediate one, not the very large one, not the very small one. The second step, actually, because we wanted to look at this reorientation and so on, we actually looked at what we call the excess of change. This is not actually our idea. We took the methodology from a paper of Dauth and Sudekon in 2016. And basically, they were looking at the sectoral composition before and after an acute shock of the Great Recession. And basically, they were defining a sort of excess of change. They were doing it at a regional level, completely different scale. We did it at municipality level. And so what this is telling you is, let's look at the percentage change of employment in a specific sector at a local level, at a municipality. And then let's compare this with the same sector, the same change in employment in the sector at a national level. How far off is the municipality from the nation, right? So this is a graphical representation of what I'm trying to tell you. On the y-axis, you have the sectors from the strongest one at a national level to the weakest one at a national level. So sector number 1 is the booming one in Italy, and the bottom one is the one that in Italy is not so strong. This is the difference between the growth in the municipality in the strongest sector going down to the same difference, but for sectors that were not so strong at a national level. So here, just to give you an idea, the top, I call them the national boom industries, and the one at the bottom, the national declining industries. And this bar that you see are the difference between the municipality and the nation. As you can see, when you look at the center, these bars are not very large because pretty much the centers are following the average national growth. But when you go down the list and you start looking at more peripheral areas, so these are the third level of peripherality, you start seeing that there are certain sectors in which the growth actually is different. So before the crisis, the booming sectors in Italy were actually locating mostly in these third degree of peripherality regions. After the crisis, this bar becomes smaller, which means that they're not booming anymore in these particular areas which are surrounding the large cities, in these intermediate areas. When you go down to the ultra-peripheral areas, initially, before the crisis, they were growing in the strongest sector at national level. So you can see this positive long bar there. After the crisis, this is completely different. as you can see, there is more growth in sectors that are not as strong. We also did a Spearman rank correlation coefficient between the pre and post-crisis ranking. And there was some kind of correlation, positive correlation in central areas and peripheral areas, but for all the others, so the intermediate and the ultra-peripheral, the correlation was not positive at all, meaning that there has been some kind of displacement of certain industry if you compare the post-crisis and the pre-crisis. Okay. And then the last thing that we did was defining whether the changes in these peripheral areas were actually pro-trend or anti-trend. So the changes in the composition of the industries at the local level, were they going in the same direction of the changes that were happening at national level or against it? Were they pro-cyclical or anti-cyclical in a sense? By looking at the graph that I showed you before, it's very easy actually to see which areas are pro-trend and which are anti-trend. So if the municipality grows more than the nation in growing sector at a national level, which are these quadrant A, or declines in declining sector at national level, so B first, then these areas are pro-trend. They're going in the same direction as the nation. On the opposite, if they are growing where the nation is not growing and they are decreasing when the nation is growing, which are quadrant A first and B, then the changes that are happening in these areas are the opposite of what is happening at the national level. These are two examples. So pro-trend, you would have a graph that looks like this. And anti-trend, actually, you would have a graph in which the longest bars are in these two quadrants that I showed you in the second slide. I'll pass this. You have that rationale of the rule and whatever. So this is the distribution. I'm almost at the end. This is the distribution of the pro-trend, anti-trend, or not significant areas at a national level. So what you can see is that in 2004, 2008, there are a lot of green areas. The nation was growing in a certain sector, so all these areas were growing in the same sectors. In 2009, 2014, it's the opposite. So you see a lot of red areas. It's as if to actually go over the crisis, this area had to reinvent themselves. So instead of actually looking at what was happening at the national level, they were trying to be innovative and specialize in something that maybe Italy is not well known of. Maybe they were not doing furniture anymore, but they were trying to do craft beers, which happened to be cases that I've studied in the Marche regions. And then the last bit of this was actually, we looked at the areas that switch. So areas that were pro-trend before the crisis and anti-trend after the crisis, so that they had a complete change in the industrial composition. And we were looking at the determinants of this area that switched. And the more peripheral the areas were, the more they were likely to have changed their industrial composition before and after the crisis. We put a lot of controls in it, but the more likely variable associated with this switching were smaller areas, less population, less institutional capacity, lower education, lower social capital. So the weakest area were kind of less strong in their specialties, and they tended to switch to kind of try and accommodate, reinvent themselves. This is my last slide. It's 43 minutes, a little bit longer than what I intended.
It's fine, Alessandra, really, it's fine, really.
And now COVID-19. I don't have many slides on this, but of course I've been thinking and talking about COVID a lot on the local news and whatever. I got so fed up with being asked, same question over and over again. Everybody's asking me what's gonna happen with COVID and peripheral areas. So there are certain people that really believe that now the COVID is the big opportunity for peripheries. And then there are other people that say, no, it's not like that. Nobody will ever go out of cities. And especially if you start doing smart working and then the cities become less congested because you can work from home, they become more attractive to people, not less attractive. And actually, we don't know, because what we are trying to do now as economists is guess how the preferences of people have changed or are going to change. Is this stress long enough for people to change some of their preferences for good? My feeling is yes. As I said even before, this veil of ignorance, right, is now removed. We know that we can do a summer school online. It's not perfect. We would all like to be in Switzerland, in Sion and whatever, but we can still do it. So I believe that now it's going to be a hybrid combination of smart working and normal, going back to the normal living. But there are opportunities and challenges for the peripheral areas if we focus on that. So one thing that has been mentioned here in Italy is that we all know the housing market is fragmented. Now there are preferences for larger houses with more outdoor space. So in Milan, for instance, people are moving a little bit out of the center of the city because during the lockdown, they really wanted a garden. People now place higher values of natural amenities and maybe a little bit less to man-made agglomeration economies, let's say. And of course, one opportunity for peripheral areas against cities is that density favors contagion. That was the first thing that everybody says. So move out to peripheral areas. And then there is a lot of talk nowadays on this proximity tourism. So Italians don't want to go abroad, they want to stay in Italy. And in Italy, they even want to stay sometimes in the same macro region or in the same region, because for a period, as you know, the interregional movement was not even allowed. So a lot of people from Lombardy, for instance, are now saying, oh, we go on holidays in Lombardy at the lakes. We don't even move to another region. Challenges for peripheral areas, well, the digital divide, and not only the digital divide as infrastructure, but the digital human capital divide. These are older people that don't know how to switch on a computer. So even if you give them the broadband, what are they gonna do with it? Are you actually gonna teach them how to use them? And then normally, like in every crisis, the worst effects are on the weakest economies. So as I said before, there might be an increase in interregional inequality, but also in poverty if although the northern strongest area were actually hit most, then the economic effects are going to be stronger in the south because of tourism, because of the weaker institution, all sorts of reasons. And then you have, as I said before, linked to the digital divide, the population is much older in these peripheral areas. They've lost the youngest people. They went away to study or so on and then never came back. And then of course there is also this health services, health provision that is not quite up to par in peripheral areas, and so most of them have to go then to central areas in the case of a sanitary crisis like the COVID. That's it. So a lot of things to think about, lots of a menu, very long menu of things to think about in relation to resilience and COVID. Thank you very much.